Greetings and salutations, viewers. I'm Charles from Inspire the Muse, and we are here at ConnectiCon 2016 yet again, this time with none other than Keith Baker, who
Howdy.
is pretty much responsible for a lot of Eberron and D&D shenanigans and a bit of gloom here and there, but the fun type of gloom.
I try to, spread gloomy joy wherever I go.
What has it been like working on the D&D Eberron campaigns and pulling all that together?
Well, Eberron, of course, was definitely a sort of life-changing experience for me. I like to consider myself the luckiest nerd in the world. For those who don't know the story, it's a little of a sort of Charlie and the Chocolate Factory situation. In 2003, Wizards of the Coast decided that they would go outside for a new world, and they took one-page submissions and got 12,000 of those submissions, of which the end result was they chose Eberron. And I certainly remember the day that they called and basically said I was getting into the second round, and I was in an airport, and they said, well, you've got to mail us, a contract sort of thing, right now, like today. And my wife and I were running around the airport, trying to find a place where we could download email and send it back, but it was extremely exciting. Certainly, throughout my general career, what I love is creating worlds and creating stories, and the opportunity over the last 13 years to really sort of develop Eberron over time, see other people working with it, has been very exciting.
What has the creation process been like for building up that lore and universe?
For me, one of the things is I do world design as a career elsewhere, so I work with MMOs, things like that, and it's always that matter of starting with sort of the core, what is it that particularly defines this, drives this, and then expanding out from that. The thing about Eberron, right now, I can't write my own Eberron stuff. We're waiting for Wizards to decide what to do with next. But it is the case that I am so familiar with the world. I do Q&As on my website and such that I just love, we just did a whole big post about different religions and such. And I just love delving down into those things because after so many years, even things that have never been written feel very real to me.
That's awesome.
Beyond that, I am working on a new role-playing game of my own, Phoenix Dawn Command, which we're releasing actually in August. And so that has been a process of essentially, in part, creating a world that I do control so that I am free to develop it. Because there is a little frustration that I can't write everything I'd like to for Eberron. And so part of making Phoenix was so I can share as much of the world, as I want with the people who play in it.
Are you able to tell us a little more about this new game?
Yeah, it is a little more directed than Eberron. Part of the point of Eberron is that it is this huge spectrum of pulp to noir, and it was intentionally designed that you could tell almost any kind of story, somewhere in Eberron. Phoenix is a more focused... it's essentially a sort of supernatural war story. It's a world that has been peaceful until very recently. There is a whole manner of supernatural threats all coming out at once. You can think of it as a little bit, though in a fantasy world, drawing on, say, World War Z aliens or Pacific Rim, where the point is terrible things are happening and we don't know why. We don't know how these things are connected. If the dead are rising, if there's werewolves in the woods, if there's sort of anything you can imagine happening somewhere, why is it all happening now? The mortals basically can't deal with this. This has been going on, it's getting worse, and again, looking to Pacific Rim, we don't have a way to stop it. But the players are basically what are called phoenixes, and they are people who have died and come back imbued with supernatural power. And the thing that really makes the game different It uses cards instead of dice, and part of that is it means the players have much more narrative control of their actions because you're looking at your hand and deciding what am I going to do with these resources. You're not just trying to do something, rolling a die and seeing if it works. So the player feels more like I know what I can do right now. But the other twist is that when you die, you come back stronger than before. Death is actually how characters improve. But you only get to come back 7 times. Ooh. And so what that means is you can have these moments that you just don't get in most games of essentially Gandalf at the Bridge of Moria, where you say, we can't beat this Balrog. It's going to kill us all unless one of us, takes the stand on the bridge.
Yeah.
And these are just awesome, really amazing cool moments. Just the game I ran yesterday had this amazing, essentially, player throwing herself, into the teeth of the enemy and bringing it down, but dying in the process. And these are these awesome moments that you just don't really have in a game where the player dying is the worst possible thing that can happen.
Yeah, when they go down, they're down.
That's the end of the story, So having a situation in a D&D game where I set up that, someone has to sacrifice themselves on the bridge would just be a really obnoxious
really
move.
Cool.
And so it just lets you have this very different type of thing. At the same time, since you do only get 7 lives, and you don't come back right away, it very much is like Gandalf, the missions are often very time sensitive, and if everybody dies, you're failing the mission, bad things will happen, and you're going to have to come back and deal with it. It's not over. But it means that you become more powerful, but you also suddenly have to be a little more careful about how you use that.
Yeah.
So I'm very happy with it. The world, as I said, it's going back to designing worlds. Phoenix is, the whole point, it is about telling the story of this struggle with the dread. It has, to me, a certain Lovecraftian element of the players are trying to stop these things as they pop up. But even more important than that is understanding them. The players have to figure out, why are these things happening? How are they related? And so again, fighting them is important, but uncovering the mystery is just as important. But still going back to it, that's the defining story. And that's one thing we tell people making characters is essentially, this is a war movie. Your character needs to be cast in this movie. So you can be fighting for whatever motivation or reason you want, but if you wouldn't be fighting, you're not in this story.
Nice.
And, the other thing that's interesting from a story perspective is the fact that part of character creation is who were you, how did you die, what gave you the will and the energy and the drive to come back. And so that's sort of baked into the game of you need to think about your backstory. In part because that defines what we call schools, which amount to class. When a Phoenix dies, the nature of their death and the lessons they learn are what shape the abilities they gain.
Okay.
So essentially it's saying if you're being a fighter, which in our world is a durant, someone who died because they weren't tough enough, how did your death define that? Why is it that you came back this way? So I'm really interested in it. As I said, that's coming out in the beginning of August.
Nice. As a D&D 4E player, I was in love with being able to create a backstory and then trying to figure out, okay, my character's now thrown in this. What do I do now? Based off of that. So.
And definitely Phoenix has, a fair bit in common. 4E was trying, in my mind, to be like more cinematic than simulationist. Is trying to get the sort of high level of action. Phoenix has that sort of level of the system is not terribly complicated. It's very flexible. But again, like I said, what it really is what I hate in many games is I'm facing the big villain. I make the heartfelt speech about, my ancestors and my vengeance. I use my biggest attack and I roll a 1. Yep. And not only is that just not how that scene played in my mind, but I've even, my turn was a dud. I got nothing. In Phoenix, because you're looking at your hand, it is random from turn to turn. You're going through your deck. There are going to be turns you are going to have a crappy hand, but you are going to know it. So you're going to look at the hand and say, this is not the turn to make that speech. What can I do with the cards that I have? And that again means you're never just throwing away a turn because you made a bad roll. You're just finding something that you can accomplish with the resources you've got. the last thing I'll say, I'm sorry to be blathering about Phoenix all day. Each Phoenix also has essentially a pool of mystical energy called sparks.
Okay.
You can burn those both for supernatural powers that your character might have, but also to add directly to the results of one of your plays, essentially a die roll. And so what that means is that you can buy success. I can say, I'm going to make this succeed, even if I don't have the great cards, but when that pool runs out, you die.
Oh.
And so that, again, comes to this point of you can do amazing things when you choose to do amazing things, but you got to make sure this is the time to do it.
It's gonna count.
And that's why I said you just tell a very different story. It's not about, do I get a magic sword or whatever. It's about can we accomplish this, and am I going to lay my life down in the process? So I'm really happy with it.
That sounds like there's going to be a lot of free reign and adaptability, but a lot of strategy too.
And that's very much the case. What I like about it is we found it's actually very good for relatively inexperienced players because the system is fairly accessible. You're just looking at your hand in front of you. You don't need to know, you never have to look something up in a book or something like that. But at the same time, for the experienced player, first off, it is a card game. There is a deck building element to it. So the person who gets the system better is going to be looking a lot more at combos they can make and things like that. But as you said, it is a lot more of when's the right moment to do this. How can we synergize? How can I help our group sort of optimize their actions and things like that.
That's really cool. I kind of want to get it.
I'm
going to have to keep an eye out for it.
Yeah, just a few weeks.
All right.
So yeah, what else can I tell you about?
We mentioned earlier that you've also been a part of Gloom. What has that experience been like in the creative process?
I have to say, up until recently, because now I've been working on Phoenix, and I'm very proud of that. Up until that, I would have said that Gloom was the thing I was proudest of, simply because while Eberron has been an amazing experience, and I love the world, it was such a fluke that Wizards decided to do this thing. People have said to me, oh, hey, I've got a setting. How can I get that published? I'm like, it's not an easy setting. It's a hard sell. And
you have to roll 20 D20s and get 20
and you gotta
on every single one
all
of them.
the sparks that you have.
Yeah.
And so the fact that Wizards decided to even do the fantasy setting search in the first place, let alone getting picked out of 12,000 entries, is something where, again, it's amazing, and I am proud of that entry, but it still is this crazy fluke, whereas Gloom is something that I came up with the idea, I prototyped it in my basement, and it's out there now and is a real thing. And so that definitely is something that, I'm very proud of, and that it's awesome to see it out in the world.
For those who aren't necessarily as familiar, how does Gloom work in comparison to the others?
It's a card game. And so it's not a role-playing game. It uses transparent cards. So that was one of the innovations. It's transparent plastic cards. And each player has a family of characters. And as you're playing cards, you're stacking them up on top of characters to build a story. And the twist is, of course, that you want your characters to suffer miserably and die while keeping your opponents happy, healthy, and alive. So you're trying to tell the most miserable story. The way I look at it is it's one of those conversations where people are sitting around saying, oh, my family had it worse than you can possibly imagine. Oh, yeah, well, my family. And so you're trying to one-up them with how miserable your story is.
It's the ultimate story escalation.
Exactly. And the issue is that you're playing cards, stacking them up on top of things, but you're also telling a story. So if I'm going to play a card saying my character was trapped on a train, I also want to explain how did the twins come to be trapped on a train. And then you're going to say, oh, but they were happily married on that train. It turns out the conductor of a train can perform marriages. And part of what makes the game fun is it is this foundation for stories, and the stories are always changing. And so, like I said, while it's not a role-playing game, it is definitely a storytelling game. And it's something where you're never judged on the stories. You could play Gloom and not tell a story, but the framework, the ability to tell a story is what really makes each game different. What I'd like to say is actually Phoenix, going back to that,
Yep.
is basically the bridge for me between Eberron and Gloom. In that it is a fantasy role-playing game, yet at the same time it is a game driven by cards. It is a game that encourages storytelling because, again, as you're playing your cards, you have certain traits in Gloom. Like you might be a commander, or you might have seen this before. When that card comes up, if you can tell me how it applies to this situation. Why is it useful here that you are a commander? Then you get a bonus in its use.
Nice.
So likewise, you don't have to come up with a story, but if you do, so it sort of helps draw people out and encourage them to think about their actions beyond just, I've got a 15. And beyond that, of course, Phoenix is a game where ultimately you want your character to die. And
Just not too many times.
and you want it to count, is what I'm always telling people. You don't want to just jump in front of a truck, and yes, you would actually get more power potentially, but you're going to regret it when down the road you wish you had one more life. So, again, for me, storytelling is always what I've loved, is creating frameworks for people to tell stories. And going from Eberron on the one side, which is very much within the D&D system and very much inspired, part of the point of Eberron is saying, if we had magic that worked the way it does in D&D, wouldn't that be integrated into society? What would the results of that be over time? All the way to something like Gloom, where the point is, you don't have to tell a story, but it's more fun if you do. And it's trying to draw people in who might not have like a lot of role-playing experience or things like that.
Very cool. For all our viewers out there, where can they find your works and your upcoming game to check out and enjoy?
The simplest way to keep track of me, I am at HellCowKeith on Twitter, and I tweet about, whenever new stuff is out. My website is Keith, Keith, -Baker, BAKER.com.
Who took the unhyphenated one?
I think he's like a travel writer who lives on the Jersey Shore or something like that. I know. There's another Keith Baker who's a children's book author, fairly renowned, and I have a number of times gotten invitations to go talk at elementary schools. And the very first time I'm like, okay, I'm a game designer. None of my games have come out yet. I guess kids, second graders want to know about careers in game design, But Keith-Baker.com, at HellCowKeith. My company is Together Studios, and that's TWO-gether. And we will be, actually, that's where you could buy Phoenix.
Okay.
But it's still going to be a couple weeks, and we're currently updating the site right now.
Okay, fantastic. Well, I think that's all the time we have, unfortunately. So thank you for joining me.
Thank you so much for having me. I've really enjoyed it.
I'm glad I got to learn about your upcoming game because I want it. Thank you all for joining us. As always, check out the YouTube channel and the website for other interviews and shenanigans that we get up to, because shenanigans. And until next time, as always, go be creative.